morning. My name is Maria for WOW TV, and welcome to another segment of the Georgia Straight Weekly. I'm here with the Chief Editor, Charlie Smith, and we're going to be talking about beer today. How are you doing today, Charlie?
Oh, I'm doing very well, thanks, Maria, and thanks for coming by.
No problem. So we have the next issue of the Georgia Straight is about the beer issue. What is the scoop on this?
Yeah, it's very interesting because as summer approaches, this is when the beer consumption starts going up quite sharply. In fact, one of the breweries, Central City Brewers and Distillers, told me they had their record week while I was researching this story, and that was in, I think, the second week of May. Basically, what I tried to do with my story, and we've got a package of about 6 stories on different aspects of beer. There's combining food with beer. There's a cooking article about a recipe you can cook with beer. You'll hear more about that in a little while. And there's also people, brewmasters and people in the industry picking their favorite beers. But what I focused on was the business of beer. And it's $1 billion industry in British Columbia. More than $1 billion worth of beer is drank last year. So there's a lot of money to be made, but it's also incredibly competitive. So that was basically the thrust of my story.
And can you tell us a little bit about branding in beer?
That's actually a very good question, Maria, because branding is kind of at the core of it. So different beers almost try to identify themselves or have a personality that they think will appeal to certain segments of the market. So you can take a beer like Steam Whistle, which comes out of Ontario. They're actually, they've got a whole bunch of environmental initiatives. So they have trucks that go traveling on biodiesel or electric, an old souped up 1958 Chevrolet pickup truck, but it's modern. They divert 96% of their materials out of the waste stream. They use heavier green bottles that last like 3 to 4 times longer than the normal brown bottles. So they've really incorporated environmental initiatives in their whole company operation. So I think I think they do it because they want to do it, but also for environmentally minded people, and particularly in urban areas, it's more of a higher quality, end on the beer side, more like an import like Heineken. But that can appeal to that type of demographic.
For sure. And you mentioned Heineken and imported beer. What do you think is your take on imported beer versus local brewed beer?
Yeah, the imports have actually been diminishing in British Columbia. Since 2007, we haven't reached the 2007 level in terms of market share. They're about 16% right now of all the beer consumed. So you can do it from the $1 billion, that's 160 million. That's a lot of imported beer, Heineken, Corona, but it's actually a relatively small portion in comparison to the total consumption. People are still drinking mostly Canadian beer.
Oh, that's great to hear. And what are some challenges facing the beer industry?
Well, one of the things that's happened is we've seen globalization of the beer industry. When I say they're drinking Canadian beer, it means beer produced in Canada. But it must be said that we have seen the big Canadian companies join forces with larger players. So you have a consortium, a Belgian-Brazilian group that bought Anheuser-Busch, which is the big Budweiser producer, and it also owns Labatt. So Labatt is an old Canadian company, but it's within this larger umbrella. At the same time, you've got Molson, and that's the other big Canadian player. It merged with Coors, which is a big American beer. So they're still producing Molson Canadian, but they're also producing Coors Light. And sometimes from a marketing perspective, there are questions about, well, which brand are they emphasizing? Are they emphasizing the Molson Canadian, or are they emphasizing the Coors beer? So you can see it when you're watching the hockey games. You'll see Budweiser being promoted as opposed to Labatt's Blue. And that's quite different from what Canadians were traditionally used to. That's on the big side. There's also a lot happening on the small side, which I think is actually the most interesting aspect of the story.
And so you had an experience visiting some local breweries. Tell me your experiences in that.
Yeah, one of the ones I visited was Central City Brewers and Distillers. And this is quite a fascinating company because it operated a brew pub, it still does, at Central City. That's where it got its name, which is basically the Surrey Centre SkyTrain, that kind of area by the SFU. But then they decided to make a bigger brewery, and it opened last November. Big capital expenditure. They hope to get to 100,000 hectoliters within 5 years. They're aiming for, their capacity now is about 35,000 hectoliters. So I walked through. They also produce gin, um, whiskey, and vodka, as well as beer. And so they've got a big brewery, they've got a brew pub, and they have a store, like a liquor store, but also lots of merchandise. And when you talk about branding, what Central City tries to do is they try to attach themselves to the bicycles. So if you look at their Red Racer beer, you see a woman riding a bicycle, and they do a lot of sponsorship in the cycling area, and they try to brand themselves that way. One of their beers they brought out, India Session Ale, is actually targeted at cyclists. It's a little lighter, so if you're going for a ride or you're mountain biking and you're stopping for a beer, that this is something that they think this is right for this market. But it's a big operation, relatively speaking. It's still called a microbrewery. A microbrewery in British Columbia is defined as 160,000 hectoliters or less. And there are tax advantages. And when they're producing the craft beers, these are heavier beers, often made by these brewmasters, and they've really caught on. And the roots go back to Horseshoe Bay. 1982 was the first craft beer being sold in BC. Granville Island Brewery opened in 1984. They're coming up on their 30th anniversary. They're a big player in this industry. So there's lots going on.
Yeah, so I definitely see that you learned a lot about the business. Did you get to see a little bit of the background of how the beer is made in this brewery?
Yeah, I was also at Granville Island Brewery, which is, these breweries often have tours too. Like you can go to Central City, you can go to Granville Island, and some of the others, and they will actually take you for a tour. So I was at Granville Island, and their brewmaster is a man named Vern Lambourne. And Vern's this colorful guy. He studied chemistry in university. He wanted to be a winemaker, but then he discovered beer. And he's made many beers. Right now, Granville Island has gone through a rebranding process. And what it's doing is it's divided its beers into 3 different categories. They've got Coastal Series, which is more their traditional beers, like the Island Lager, which is the one best known. They've got an Under the Bridge series, which is a little stronger brew, and it harkens back to the days of Granville Island, and they were founded by a guy named Mitch Taylor and the Barefoot Gang, and they'd make their beer. And Vern is the one who's producing these beers. And then they have a 3rd series where they do kind of specialty beers in more limited distribution. But one of their beers, they've come out with a seasonal beer this summer. They like to brand that they're local, that they have Science World. It's a raspberry flavored beer. And Science World is on the cover, the Tell Us Science World, as a big raspberry. So that's, it's quite fun. But there are many others out there. Like there's Parallel 49 is one of the big breweries. How Sound Brewing is another big player. There's Storm Brewing. We've actually had a proliferation of the smaller craft breweries, and it's quite monumental in terms of the growth of the industry, and it is creating challenges for the big global players like Molson Coors and the Belgian, Brazilian group that owns Labatt's.
Very true. And through your research, what did you find were the most popular beers Canadians are drinking, or in Vancouver?
I should know the answer to this question. And in terms of the most popular, the craft beer, by some estimates, like the Campaign for a Real Ale, which is a group called CAMRA Vancouver, CAMRA, it says that the craft beers are about 30% of the market right now. So the traditional beers are still dominant. But at the same time, I think we can see this growth, and particularly in urban areas, and some cities like Portland, for instance, it's known as a center of craft beer. Oh, yes. And so Portland has turned this into an asset for tourism, and they're generating tourism and come and visit the breweries. I think we're going to see more of that in Vancouver in the coming years as Tourism Vancouver looks at, wow, these craft breweries, Vancouver's a real center. We're number 1 in Canada. There's a fair amount of it taking place in Toronto too, but in Vancouver, we're real leaders in Canada. So I think we could leverage this for more tourism visits in the future.
Yes, for sure. And what was one of the most interesting things you found through your experience in researching about beer?
Well, maybe one of the most interesting things wasn't about beer, it was about vodka. When I was at Central City Brewers and Distillers, learning that the vodka actually goes through 21 distillations before it actually ends up in the glass. Another thing I found, which was interesting, which was not related to beer, was I interviewed Daryl Frost, who's the founder and president of Central City. He has an autistic child, and he was doing a fundraiser with his company for autism, but he's actually discovered that his child has experienced a lot of success as a result of dietary changes. This is off topic of the beer, but he's been funding this research and trying to generate a research project at SFU that will look at a trial of looking at children when they undergo hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which his son has done. He's 5 years old. He was diagnosed at 2.5. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and then looking at the children who have gone on this really clean diet, organic, only eating things from the garden, the sea, and the earth, and not eating processed foods, plus having hyperbaric oxygen therapy treatments against a control group of children who've been diagnosed with autism, getting hyperbaric oxygen therapy, who are not on this super clean diet. Because he's of the opinion, but he says, I'm just a brewery guy, I'm not a scientist or a professor, but he has seen some success with his child, and he's not alone. Other parents have tried this too, so we'll see where that goes. That may have been actually the most interesting thing I learned, but I made that a separate article and put it in the health section of this week's Georgia Straight.
Yeah, that definitely sounds very interesting. So thank you so much, Charlie, for sharing your expertise on the beer. And make sure to check out the Georgia Straight with the beer issue this week. Thank you for watching WOW TV. I'm Maria, and have a good day.